Hello, my name is Wendy LUNDGAARD. I'm really delighted to be presenting to you today. My topic is workforce mobilisation to boost respect, safety and real inclusion. A very important topic, one that I've been working with organisations in my consulting practice over the last few years. And it's an extension of my diversity and inclusion work because without this, it's very difficult to achieve real progress in diversity. During our session today, we're going to look at the common forms of disrespect at work and see whether you notice any of these and have been party to walking past and perhaps turning a blind eye to some of this behaviour. We'll also examine some of the research on incivility and workplace productivity. This is important because if we know the impact, business might take discussions around disrespect far more seriously. I'm sharing with you my bystander action model for inclusion, something that gives people a framework to think about what their options are as a colleague. And we know that colleague intervention is one of the most powerful forms of mitigating disrespect. And intervention options for peers at a more detailed level to examine which might be appropriate for which situations and think towards the broader system supports for organisations today. What are we doing to ensure that we've got the right workplace cultural environment to actually activate the bystander action model? When David Morrison led the army in Australia, he came across some situations of very difficult behaviour that was occurring in the military college. And in coming before the media, he made the statement that the standard of behaviour we walk past is the standard we accept, which launched a really positive campaign about thinking what is our responsibility when we are observers to disrespectful behaviour. What we tolerate, what we walk past and what we condone ultimately shapes the workplace culture that we invariably have. So it's important to think about what our role is as an individual, not just expect people at more senior levels to take action, when in fact the evidence from La Trobe University's study found that it's through colleague intervention, a peer level intervention, that can have the most impact on mitigating the worst behaviours of colleagues. I asked this question when I commenced my Respect at Work programs. What does disrespect look like to you? And there's been a number of responses, but they typically fall within these 10 or 12 points. From sexism to racism, the kind of casual nature that happens so that it's not seen as significant in any way, through to belittling, inappropriate jokes, selective greetings, exclusion, ageism, swearing, favouritism, gossiping, whispering, loudness, and indeed yelling. Have you seen any of these things? Would you have considered them disrespectful workplace activities and behaviours, or would you have considered them just part of how we operate around here? Not many of us have really taken the time to think about what the implications are for not addressing incivility at work. And the research done by Christine Parath identified there are very significant impacts for the organisation as well as the individuals. It found that employees cut back their efforts to the tune of 66% if they saw incivility occurring at work and if it happened without any intervention. Indeed, if you were seeing this incivility at work, you're likely to spend time thinking about and worrying about that very intervention, particularly if you were the target. All of these have a significant impact on not only motivation and engagement of people to be their best at work, but also on productivity. Indeed, the ultimate is to leave your job because of incivility, and 12% of the people in her research study did just that. And we know from work within human resources that we need to factor in a cost to turnover that is somewhere between 75 and 150% of the first year's salary. Because we need to factor in that it's not just the recruitment time and effort and the recruitment cost, but also the onboarding time and the time it takes for a person to come up to speed in a new role. This is considered to be unintended consequences of incivility at work. So is doing nothing really an option anymore? If you think about in Australia, the workplace legislation on health and well-being, it goes to not only what we do that could potentially cause harm to others and ourselves, both physically and psychologically, but also what we don't do. That is also referenced in the legislation. And few of us have really thought about, I posit, the consequences of not taking bystander activism when we see people disrespected, because that disrespect can be very harmful, hurtful, and may cause not only physical but psychological injury to the individual. Putting perspective around what disrespect looks like, I think we need to gauge it from the rude and unpleasant, inappropriate and unprofessional, but on a scale that may be helpful to the discussion around this. And I find this and the language around this is very useful. To go from not nice, what's the difference? From not nice to mean, it's the intentionality. And then to go from mean to illegal, it's the repetitive nature of what we know to be intentional behaviour, which is armed to be hurtful, and we keep doing it. Recognising that an intention alone is not determined by the perpetrator. And the reasonable person test, having regard to the circumstances, could it be expected that a person is impacted adversely from this particular behaviour? The not nice, the mean, to the illegal. We've spent a lot of time telling people what not to do because it's illegal in compliance training and onboarding training. Yet we still see that a lot of the behaviour that is unacceptable in workplace may fall short of being illegal, but it's nonetheless impactful. Why does disrespect happen? We need to take a lens to our workplace culture. What are the norms, beliefs, and assumed values that we buy into when we join a workplace? There are some common themes in my work that I've identified. Firstly, if behaviour is not part of what we measure, if it's all about the achievement, the quantifiable, the time-bound, the cost savings, but not about the behaviour that supports that. What about colleague indifference? Sometimes colleagues might be just relieved that the attention is on someone else and not themselves. But it's been tolerated over time. Our workplace culture supports this. It's just how people are in this organisation. And yet new people coming to that workplace see it as very strange behaviour. They see disrespect and incivility quite profoundly because they're looking at it from fresh eyes. And managers not addressing the issues, turning a blind eye, hoping it will go away, really is one of the hallmarks of a workplace cultural system. You can almost be guaranteed that there are policies that are very clear about unacceptable psychological harm to individuals, and yet we don't address it. And at times there's this lack of clarity between where the line is drawn, like in our tachometer previous slide. And perhaps some of the language around that might be helpful in discussing just where is the line and what's acceptable and unacceptable. There's also a reluctance to take action because it might make it worse. It might inflame the perpetrator and make things worse. And that's also a consequence of fear if we are reporting or calling it out. And finally, seeing it as someone else's job. And I think the clarity around our workplace health and safety obligations puts front and centre our obligations as colleagues and peers. That is, it's just as much our job to call out bad behaviour as it is our manager's job. And we're more likely to be on the ground and seeing it happen or hearing it happen. I'd like to introduce my bystander action model to you as a way of thinking about this from a framework perspective. You can see through the centre, there's an arrow which goes to a more passive approach through to a more active and proactive approach. And this really is what I consider the impact grid. If we want to alter our culture, we may need to be more active than passive. Nevertheless, there's still room for all of these quadrants to have their moment, for them to, they all have a legitimacy and perhaps should be done in concert with each other. We go from the lower left-hand side, role modelling respectful behaviour. Wouldn't it be great if everyone did bring their best selves to work and be respectful from morning till night? Advocate for change, thinking about how we might fine-tune the organisation and its systems to think about whether we're really rewarding the appropriate behaviour that we want to see in everyone. Down to our lower quadrant, down the right-hand side, this is moving more to supporting the individual to step in and recognise that there are things we can do to deflect and to support. And we'll go through those in more detail. And finally, the calling out poor behaviour. There's some cautions around that, and I will explain those in more details. But calling out behaviour is seen as having the most significant impact on employee behaviour, particularly when it comes from the peers. So in more detail now, we'll look at the advocate of change, thinking about this model from 4 process steps. What can we do to be asking the employees themselves, taking pulse checks, and there are key questions that we might be able to ask that go to respect, belonging and inclusion. And this is important to gauge whether there is some aspects of our workplace culture that we need to target. So in number 2, we're thinking about what is supporting these poor behaviours. Is it competitive practices that we have? Is it silo and very clear delineations between departments who don't talk together and don't have that opportunity to work cross-functionally? Is there a pervasive culture of negativity? Or is language an issue, that we've accepted certain terminology and language and that's been part now of our DNA? Once we have 1 and 2, we can start to think about point number 3, instigating and by clarifying and re-educating expected behaviours. Have we been really clear in the past through our values to enunciate what our promise is, not only to our external stakeholders, but to our internal colleagues as well? Or has our focus been more external to the organisation? We need to think about how we clarify what behaviour is acceptable and even go as far as to say what behaviour is not and put it in black and white. And following on from that, we need to educate our managers on redress measures. These are the sorts of things that give managers confidence to take action. And if we are thinking about improving the organisation, we need to do so with a lens of what are our reward systems recognising? Do we have behaviour as part of key performance indicators? Linking back to our values, they make a very strong case for being just as valid as not what, as to support the what we do, but how we do it. If we look at the step in component, we're looking at creating a diversion if possible. So this is at the time when something is occurring. We look at checking in with that person. If a diversion is not possible, check in and ensure the person is okay after that disrespectful interaction. To reaffirm with that person that that behaviour was not acceptable and not okay and not their fault. And finally, to think about what are the proactive steps that person might be encouraged to take with your support. That might be to have the conversation with the individual. It could be reporting that individual. It could be looking at formal EAP counselling and just having someone to talk to work that through, being mindful that not everybody can go to what action they need to take straight away. They need to process and reflect. And finally, the calling it out. And I said there are some particular nuances with this, and let's look at this closely. What is your unique identity relative to the individual you want to call out their behaviour? If you share some commonalities, then it may be appropriate to call it out then and there. But for most people, they will think to review speaking with them at another time, a particular time that might be one-on-one, as opposed to at the time, which could see them lose face in front of other people, and that has a response that may be somewhat predictable, that might be defensive and escalation. But if the relationship is strong and you are part of what we call the in-group, then you may well be able to do that then and there with your own particular style. Point number 3, to the person, explain what you saw, explain what you heard, and include what you envisage the impact will be on the person. To bring through an awareness of their intention may be their defence, but in fact, it isn't, as we've talked about. Intention is not determined by the perpetrator. And over to 4, assume that the person is unaware of their impact. And this sets it up for a positive environment to have that conversation, to provide the coaching on what expected behavioural standards actually are in the workplace. With the framework in mind, there are some essential elements that need to support this implementation of this framework. Having a shared language, having some familiarity and common purpose. You don't just put the bystander action model up there on the wall and expect everyone to understand it and know and follow it. There needs to be a gradual introduction of what that means, supported by the values of the organisation. And I'd say, complementing compliance training, we need to think about respect at work, because it takes away from the discussion about what not to do and enables people to think about what they can do to support each other. There needs to be management support for the bystander action model, because this can't exist in isolation without that support and the backing. So when peers call out unacceptable behaviour, they are supported. And ensuring appropriate avenues for redress are there, the grievance procedure, whether they be formal or informal. The safety to report, and contact officers who might be equipped with as trusted advisors. Without elevating the matter, people can take it to contact officers to have a confidential conversation and equip themselves with actions. And indeed, finally, and most importantly, consequences for poor behaviour, which can be anything from counselling through to disciplinary actions through to termination. In wrapping up, I hope that the bystander action model may have a place in your organisations to help explain that as a bystander, we should be mobilised to act in some way that's appropriate to us. And what we've done today is really, just to wrap up, common forms of disrespect. We've looked at the cost of incivility. We've explored bystander action model and its components by looking at what peer-initiated options are available to us. And we've also discussed some essential workplace system supports. I hope this has been helpful to you, and I'd love to get your feedback or further the conversation with you on this important topic. My details are provided here, and I hope that I hear from you soon. I also have a LinkedIn profile, so please contact me there. Bye for now.